Welcome, traveler of time. You've entered a realm where kings rise, empires fall, and every crown carries a curse. Today, we journey through the life of one of history's most fascinating monarchs, where love, power, and destiny intertwine. It is a winter morning in London, the year of our Lord 1649. Snow drifts like silent ash through the air. A wooden scaffold stands before Whitehall Palace, stark, simple, surrounded by soldiers. On it waits a man who was once a god among men, Charles Stuart, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The murmurs of thousands fill the square, not cries of anger, but an eerie silence, like the pause before a storm. The people have come to see their king die. He steps forward calm, composed. His eyes, deep and sorrowful, scan the crowd as if searching for understanding, or perhaps forgiveness. Beneath the black cloak, he wears two shirts so that the cold will not make him tremble. He will not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. For this is no ordinary execution. This is a divine undoing, the moment when the idea of sacred kingship itself is cut down. How did it come to this? How did a man born to rule by God's command end beneath the blade of mortal justice? The story begins far from this scaffold, in a palace of marble and gold, where a timid boy was destined to carry a burden heavier than any crown. He was not born for the throne. Charles was the second son of King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England and his Danish queen, and he entered the world frail and silent, his life uncertain even in its first breath. His father, the great unifier of crowns, saw him as weak, a boy too delicate to survive the weight of royalty. But Charles was a quiet fire. Though his speech stammered and his limbs trembled, his eyes burned with determination. He sought solace not in play, but in prayer, in the solemn halls of chapels where candles flickered and saints seemed to listen. In those early years, he lived in the shadow of his elder brother, Prince Henry, strong, noble, adored by all. When Henry died suddenly in 1612, the court wept for its golden prince, and in that silence, Charles's destiny shifted. The timid boy became heir to 3 kingdoms. He was shaped by loneliness. His tutors taught him the divine order of the world, that kings ruled not by men's will, but by God's design. He absorbed it as truth, as marrow in his bones, that faith would guide and ultimately destroy him. When his father died in 1625, Charles became king at 24. The crown that once gleamed with promise now felt like a halo of thorns. He moved through the coronation with grace, his lips sealed in prayer. Yet even then, a shadow hung over him. The Parliament of England, restless and proud, demanded power. They whispered that no man should rule by divine right alone. Charles listened, but he did not yield, for he believed, utterly, that kingship was a covenant between God and the monarch, not between ruler and subject. And in that belief lay both his majesty and his doom. In the grandeur of court life, Charles sought comfort in love. He married Henrietta Maria, the young Catholic princess of France, a union meant to bind 2 great powers, yet it bound him instead to suspicion and scorn. England was fiercely Protestant. Whispers spread that the king's heart was ruled by a papist queen. But Charles adored her. Their letters, tender and fervent, spoke of a love few monarchs ever knew. She became his solace in a world turning cold. Yet love made him stubborn. He surrounded himself with beauty, commissioning painters like Van Dyck, architects, poets. His court became a sanctuary of art and faith, while outside, poverty and dissent grew. He demanded funds for his wars. Wars fought not for conquest, but for control. Parliament refused. He dissolved them, again and again, declaring that God alone had chosen him, and no earthly assembly could defy that will. But power, once seized in solitude, isolates its holder. He began to trust only those who echoed his thoughts. His advisors, like the ill-fated Duke of Buckingham, deepened his divide from the people. When Buckingham was assassinated, Charles withdrew further into silence, into pride. Years passed in uneasy peace. Taxes were levied without consent. Dissenters were punished. And across the land, the image of the king, once noble and divine, began to crack. Still, in his private hours, he walked the gardens with his queen, holding her hand as the sun set behind the palace walls. He was a man torn between two worlds, one celestial, one human, and neither would forgive him. The storm began in Scotland. Charles, ever the believer in divine order, imposed a new prayer book upon the Scottish Church. The Scots revolted, declaring that no king could dictate the voice of God. To raise an army, Charles needed Parliament. When they returned in 1640, their faces were grim. These men no longer bowed to crowns. They came not to serve, but to judge. They demanded reforms, punishment for his ministers, and limits on royal authority. Charles, proud and inflexible, resisted. When he tried to arrest 5 members of Parliament by force, they escaped. London rose in outrage. The fragile peace shattered. By 1642, England was at war with itself. The Royalists, loyal to the crown, fought under the banner of the White Rose. The parliamentarians, under Oliver Cromwell and his godly soldiers, fought for what they called liberty and faith. It was not only a war of swords, it was a war of beliefs. Each side claimed to serve God. Each prayed for victory. Charles rode into battle with quiet dignity, his armor polished, his white plume gleaming above the smoke. His presence inspired loyalty. His soldiers saw in him the last echo of chivalry. But chivalry could not match the discipline of Cromwell's new army. The Ironsides, fanatical, efficient, unstoppable. The fields of England ran red. At Naseby, at Marston Moor, the royal forces fell. The king watched his banners burn, his friends slain, his cause dissolve like mist. In 1646, defeated and desperate, he surrendered, not to Parliament, but to the Scots, hoping for compassion. They saw not a sovereign, but a bargaining chip. For £400,000, they sold him to his enemies. The once divine monarch became a prisoner of men. They placed him under guard, yet treated him with outward respect. He dined from silver plates, read his Bible, and corresponded with his children. But the world outside was changing faster than his prayers could keep pace. He believed still that God would deliver him. He believed that compromise was sin. When offered peace, if only he would renounce his divine right. He refused. He would rather lose his crown than admit that power came from the people. And so, while he prayed, others plotted. Cromwell's army, radical and righteous, grew impatient. They accused Parliament itself of weakness, claiming that the Lord had chosen them to purge corruption. In 1648, royalist uprisings erupted once more, inspired by the king's letters and coded messages. They were crushed, and with their defeat, the patience of England ended. A king who could not learn to bend would now be broken. They brought him south, through the winter mist, to London. As his carriage rolled past silent crowds, he gazed out through barred windows. He saw not hatred in their eyes, but sorrow. Some bowed their heads as he passed. Others crossed themselves. Few cheered. It was as if England itself mourned what it was about to do. It was unthinkable, yet it happened. For the first time in history, an English king stood trial before his own subjects. The court was assembled by force, a chamber of men chosen not by law, but by revolution. They accused Charles Stuart of treason, of waging war against his own people. When asked to plead, he refused. I do stand more for the liberty of my people than any here who come to be my pretended judges, he declared. He denied their authority, for to him, kings answered only to God. But the verdict was foregone. Guilty. Sentence, death. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, he awoke before dawn. He dressed carefully, black breeches, a silk waistcoat, and 2 shirts so the chill would not betray his calm. He prayed with his chaplain, Bishop Juxon, who whispered, "You are exchanging a temporal crown for an eternal one." Outside, the scaffold waited. Soldiers lined the street. Drums muffled the sound of weeping. Charles walked with quiet grace, his steps steady. He turned to the bishop and said softly, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown." The crowd parted as he climbed the steps. The axe lay gleaming in the frost. He addressed the people briefly, his voice steady, almost gentle. "I die the king your father loved you to be," he said. "I forgive all men." Then, kneeling upon the block, he stretched out his hands, the signal. The axe fell with a single, clean sound. A gasp rose from the crowd, then silence. Some bowed their heads as he passed. Others crossed themselves. Few cheered. It was as if England itself mourned what it was about to do. It was unthinkable, yet it happened. For the first time in history, an English king stood trial before his own subjects. The court was assembled by force, a chamber of men chosen not by law, but by revolution. They accused Charles Stuart of treason, of waging war against his own people. When asked to plead, he refused. "I do stand more for the liberty of my people than any here who come to be my pretended judges," he declared. He denied their authority, for to him, kings answered only to God. But the verdict was foregone. Guilty. Sentence, death. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, he awoke before dawn. He dressed carefully, black breeches, a silk waistcoat, and 2 shirts so the chill would not betray his calm. He prayed with his chaplain, Bishop Juxon, who whispered, "You are exchanging a temporal crown for an eternal one." Outside, the scaffold waited. Soldiers lined the street. Drums muffled the sound of weeping. Charles walked with quiet grace, his steps steady. He turned to the bishop and said softly, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown." The crowd parted as he climbed the steps. The axe lay gleaming in the frost. He addressed the people briefly, his voice steady, almost gentle. "I die the king your father loved you to be," he said. "I forgive all men." Then, kneeling upon the block, he stretched out his hands, the signal. The axe fell with a single, clean sound. A gasp rose from the crowd, then silence. The executioner lifted the head by its hair and cried, "Behold the head of a traitor!" But no cheer came. Many turned away. Some sobbed. In that instant, England crossed a line it could never return from. The body of Charles was laid in a simple coffin, wrapped in white linen. There was no royal procession, no golden tomb. Only a handful of loyal followers stood as the wind swept over St. George's Chapel at Windsor. Outside, the monarchy was gone. England called itself a commonwealth. But liberty bought in blood soon turned to silence. Cromwell ruled with iron will, a king in all but name. And yet, the image of Charles would not fade. His letters, his final words, his dignity on the scaffold, all transformed him from tyrant to martyr. Painters captured his calm profile, poets called him saintly, and his enemies found themselves haunted by his grace. 11 years later, the wheel of fate turned again. When Cromwell's protectorate collapsed, Charles II, the dead king's son, returned to England. The bells that once tolled for the father now rang for the son. He ordered the men who signed his father's death warrant hunted, executed, their bodies quartered and displayed. Justice or vengeance, it mattered little. The age of kings had returned, but it would never again be the same. For in killing a king, England had killed the illusion of divine perfection. No crown would ever again sit without the shadow of that scaffold. Centuries have passed. Whitehall still stands. And some nights, beneath the moonlight, they say a figure walks, dressed in black, calm and composed, his breath visible in the cold. He pauses where the scaffold once stood, gazing toward the crowd that is no longer there. The ghost of Charles I, the king who would not yield. And in the echoes of his last words, one can still hear the quiet defiance of a man who lost everything but his soul. Centuries later, the echoes of the execution of Charles I still haunt the ruins of history. If stories like this fascinate you, don't forget to like and subscribe. More untold tales of history await you.